This presentation is copyrighted by Norman Retzky, 2016. All rights are reserved and is not to be duplicated without prior written consent of the author. This is for presentation at the Briarcliff Lakes Manor Homes Annual Meeting 2016. First, there's no substitute for planning and preparation, and in 2010 it was declared we would complete the roofs in 2016, and we are doing this. In 2010 we had to do a lot of things to put this all into place. This presentation is to the shareholders of a business. It is not intended to be either positive or negative, but it is intended to provide some facts. There are of course no guarantees for future results. I do want to emphasize that what boards do each year makes a difference, and owners really need to be aware of the decisions that are made. Currently, I see no short-term financial issues for our association. That means reasonable fee increases. However, boards must be diligent, and this presentation is my evidence for that. I want to add that it will take many, many steps, and it has taken many steps, thousands of steps to accomplish what's depicted here and what will possibly occur in the future. The next series of charts were prepared in 2010. This is one of the first tasks that I undertook as a new board member. The board that came into place in 2008 decided to answer the questions about whether our reserves were adequate, whether we had sufficient funding, whether in fact we had too much or too little money in our savings, and so on, by authorizing a reserve study. The reserve study, in fact, raised almost as many questions that it answered, and it did indicate that we were deficient in funding. It suggested that we replace all of the exterior panels on the buildings and the trim. This is everything above the brick. It suggested that to accomplish the tasks that it laid out, we would require a series of annual 10.5% fee increases, a $1.5 million loan, and that would be paid for with a special assessment. This challenge was taken up, and an incredible amount of work was undertaken in the fall of 2010 by me to answer the questions of what really do we need to do and what was possible and what kind of funding levels would be required. These charts indicate a plan to address some of the major issues in the association, including masonry, driveways, and the roofs and the garage floors, and indicated a schedule that by which these could be accomplished. In fact, one of the primary things that needed to be accomplished were the roofs, because these had been built. The latest update had been in the early 1990s. They would be 20 years old by 2013, and these roofs were only designed for a life of 18 to 20 years. So clearly we had to do some things and do them quickly. The plan was to do the things, put in place the funding and everything else that it would take to complete the roofs in 2016. And in fact, that is exactly what is happening. Another purpose to this video is to provide information to owners who are observing it, and it is quite likely that one or more of them will be future board members. The information presented in this video will have to be executed over a period of years. I'll be presenting some information about the future 10 years of the association. It's quite probable none of the existing board members will be doing this work or leading it. So how do we go about doing this? First of all, we need annual budget analysis, and that can sometimes be contentious. In other words, it's quite likely that some of the people who are viewing this as owners will be determining our future budgets. Now, our budgets fall into two categories or parts. There's the operations and maintenance, which we call O&M, and then there are reserves. The operations and maintenance are short-term budgets. They're designed for 1 year. They cover everything from snow removal to utilities such as water and electricity, the painting of 1/6 of our buildings each and every year, and the replacement of panel and trims where that's necessary as part of that exterior painting. They include minor asphalt repairs, minor concrete repairs. They include accounting. They include our replacement of light bulbs. They include the work done by our management companies, our accountant, and nearly all of the contractors that are involved in infrastructure work. The second part of the budgeting is reserves. Reserves are the consequences of long-term planning. And reserves are also the consequences of a reserve or multiple reserve studies. Reserves are funds that are saved for infrastructure work. Infrastructure work includes the recently completed roofing project, which began in 2003 and was completed in 2016. Think about that, a project that required saving, planning, and execution for more than 10 years. That's what I call a mega project. It includes replacement or work on streets, our recent replacement of Lake Cliff Boulevard. It will include additional work on other streets. These are all major significant projects. They can't be accomplished in 1 year. The funds can't be acquired or saved in 1 year. That is the purpose of reserves. And it is absolutely necessary to achieve reserve saving targets via long-term planning. Now, short-term problems can be managed without fee shocks to owners if the reserve savings are adequate. Challenge is determining what those long-term savings are to be. This requires the allocation of fees each year as a part of the annual budget preparation. And with that knowledge and mindful of the future, we can make short-term adjustments. And there's an example of that in 2015. Bottom line is it important for owners that the board manage reserves in our association so as to avoid or minimize fee surprises. And there is a goal to treat all owners equally, including current and future. In other words, fees for reserve must be impartial, and boards should avoid kicking the can down the road to the detriment of future owners. The next series of charts provide an indication of where our fees have gone from 2002 to 2016, and also to provide some additional information on the importance of budgeting. That begins in 2002 because I became an owner in 2002. I actually attempted to purchase in 2001, but the closing was delayed until early in 2002. Okay. Since 2002, the fees necessary for the combined budgets, which is the sum saved for operation and maintenance and reserves, have increased by about 4.5% each year. That's a lot. Now, why was that? Why did that occur? Well, since 2002, in fact, the fees attributable or put aside for reserves increased by more than 7% per year. At the same time, the fees for operations and maintenance increased by only about 1.5% per year. In other words, fees for reserves increased 5 times faster than did the operation and maintenance fees from that period. How much was collected? Well, since 2002, about $4.6 million has been collected for reserves. About half of what was collected was spent on the roofing project. That's an extraordinary amount of money. This is what we call mega projects. Also, since 2002, about $12 million was collected for operation and maintenance. The amounts that were collected were nearly entirely spent each and every year. So the question becomes for each board every year is, are we on track for reserve savings, and what other mega projects are planned for the future? I want to emphasize that reserve studies are necessary and they are a valuable tool for guiding our boards, but they are imperfect. They are in fact estimates prepared by outside experts. They need to be supplemented from time to time with proper engineering studies and the input of a variety of experts. One of the things that's helpful is frequent physical surveys of the common elements. This can be done by board members and management, and currently in our association, most of that work is in fact done by the architectural director with the assistance of maintenance director and management. Some of these surveys can be supplemented with outside help. For example, the core samples that were taken of our streets a couple of years ago were extremely useful in determining the actual condition of the streets. We drilled down 30 inches or so to determine the thickness and condition of the asphalt, the base, and the subbase. That told us quite a bit more about the nature of the problems we were facing at the street. And I would say that the time spent determining appropriate reserves is worthwhile. This chart shows the rise in fees attributable to operation and maintenance in our budgets each and every year. As a consequence of increases from about $638,000 in 2002 to nearly $898,000 in 2016, the fees to owners for this, to accomplish this, increased by about an average of 1.5% each year. The next slide indicates the budgeting problem that occurred in 2015. Now, boards have a number of options in addressing this. One of the simplest and most straightforward is just to raise fees to accommodate the requirements of the operations and maintenance budget for the forthcoming year. However, boards also have the option of making a minor adjustment to the reserve funding for that same year. If they can do that, the consequence is smoothing of the fees for the owners. And with a little research, boards can sometimes discover that this can be accommodated with absolutely no negative detriment to the reserve budgeting, future budgets, and so on. And that's exactly what happened at our association in 2015. So the board decided to reduce the funding for reserves in 2015 by a slight amount. This was determined that to be acceptable considering what was necessary for reserves for the next 10 years and in recognition of the 30-year plan. So the consequence, the fees did not increase by a dramatic amount in that year. In fact, it was less than 2%. However, you'll notice that in 2016, the board did decide to increase the allocation to reserves. Now, you could say this decision was made to handle the reduction of 2015, but in fact, that's not really true. What occurred was the board was faced with the death of over 100 trees, extraordinary expenses to remove them, and even more expenses to replace them, doing grading, sodding, shrubbery, whatever. And the decision was made to put an unusual amount of money into that project. There's some question whether that's the appropriate way to do this, because unfortunately, once funds are put into reserves, they can't be removed. It could be stated that it might be better to put it into operations and maintenance, and then if there's a surplus at the end of the year, move that money, the remaining surplus, over to reserves. But the board in 2015, October, decided not to do that. Now, boards have other approaches they can use. One is to simply increase fees by a modest amount, or what is considered an acceptable amount, each and every year, and take the excess and apply it to reserves. The problem with this is fees can rise by incredible amounts over a period of years. For example, as I mentioned earlier, our fees in this association rose by 4.5% each and every year from 2002 to approximately 2013. The consequence of a 4.5% increase, if would occur today for 10 years, would raise our fees from about $330 per month to more than $512 per month. Obviously, that's not an acceptable approach. So what boards need to do is really crunch the numbers and figure out what it's going to take to operate long term when there are substantial reserve requirements necessary. So what are our near-term and long-term requirements for our reserves? Well, here's a chart that was presented to the owners. And this indicates what's been gleaned from the updates prepared for our reserve studies in 2015 and takes into account what is being accomplished in 2016. So this chart covers the period 2016 to 2025. It's 10 years. We do have a study and we do have a plan that covers 30 years, but there are questions about that plan when we get beyond 10 years. And there are a lot of uncertainties 10 years out and beyond. There are even short-term uncertainties, but this does provide some idea where the money would go based upon current collections. Those collections are about approximately, in our case, $400,000 per year. This chart accommodates a modest increase of about 2% per year for reserves. Remember, reserves are only 1/3 of our budget. So in fact, a 2% increase would be less than a 3/4% increase to our fees. So adding that to our operations and maintenance budget requirements actually determines the fees that will be required over the next 10 years. This chart is in descending order of money expenditures. We do face some additional work on our streets. We are a private room development, and we did replace our major street in the last 2 years. And we also replaced the water mains that go beneath it in anticipation of the fact that our water mains are currently 40 years of age. The street that has been properly engineered and installed could in fact have a life of 30 to 40 years with good maintenance. So it's quite likely the mains will be replaced before the street fails. So we have an additional $467,000 allocated over 10 years in our budgets for streets. We have an additional $456,000 for our interior carpeting, which we do periodically. The intercoms are 40 years old. The lighting on our entrances and hallways is also 40 years old. And our mailboxes and entry doors are similar. Water mains and related, we've allocated $448,000. Some of this will be for repair, and some of this will be for long-term replacement. In fact, we're spending about $10,000 annually for short-term problems, basically dealing with what I would call water main breaks. Masonry walls and our windowsills. Windowsills are brick. They really need to be replaced with limestone. This project has begun. It's stalled a couple of times because of vendor issues, but we have $400,000 allocated to that. Again, if you divide all of these by 10, you come up with about $40,000 a year. Drainage and landscaping. We have extraordinary landscaping. We have rolling hills. It's bizarre actually, but it's lovely. So we have an additional $37,000 a year, or $372,000 to deal with that. Roofs, most of the money that's allocated here will be spent this year. Our roofing project uses high-end architectural shingles, an extraordinary amount of ice and water shield, Kynar flashing, and so on and so forth. These roofs are designed for 30 to 40 years, but we're probably planning for begin replacement within 25 years. That's prudent. So all the money shown here will be spent this year as part of the current project. Our concrete ponds, our creeks, and our walks. We have 3 creeks, which are man-made, with ponds and streams and, of course, waterfalls. These range from good to fair condition. We have already done a survey in 2015. We have a budget in place based upon estimates, or I would say actual quotations from our most reputable contractor. We could begin work on this, and we will continue to work on this. We've done work in the last 5 years. We have $268,000 budgeted for that. Unallocated, we'll skip over that for the moment. Garage floors, our floors, many of them are 40 years of age, but we have replaced about 8 in the last 5 years. We'll do more. It's going to be a requirement to do more. They will be 50 years old by the time this expenditure chart runs out. Our common decks, gazebo, and pedestrian bridges, work has been done on some of those. The gazebo will need to be replaced within the time period shown. We have $73,000 for that. Unit patios and decks are limited common elements attached to each of our units. We replaced 4 this year. There will be another 4 to be replaced within the near term because they are supported on piers, which are sunk, wooden piers, I might add, which are sunk into streams, and they're degrading. And the best way to do that is simply pull the decks out, put in concrete piers, and so on and so forth, and put in new decks above them. Exterior lighting, we are a private room development, so we do have lighting on the buildings, we have street lighting, and so on. That's the amounts for that. Finally, the unallocated. We are, as a PUD, we do own our water mains and our sewers. Frankly, given the information we have, no one really knows how to go about and precisely when to go about the replacement of our water mains. There are several options for this, but let's just say that the most prudent approach would be in the near term to hire an engineering firm provide us with an analysis and a study. The study was not a detailed plan. In fact, what it would be is simply a determination of the costs or possible costs, a determination of how many years it would take to do this, where to start, where to end, when to begin, and also how to tie in each of the buildings. We have 84 connections to our water mains. So this all has to be determined. That some of that money could come out of the unallocated. Now, looking at this chart, what we have is at the beginning, the chart is based upon an extraordinary amount of work that's been done over the last 5 years, and that includes site surveys, reserve updates, working with contractors, engineers, and so on, as well, of course, management. The next series of charts merely depicts the annual changes in the fees and the amounts allocated to operations and maintenance and to reserves. And you'll notice that reserves rose dramatically. At the beginning of the charts, reserves were about 15%. Today, they're more than 30% of our annual budgets. What does our budgeting look like and what's the process? Well, the next series of tables indicate what that might be like. This is an example from our proposed budget for 2016. This budget includes income as well as major expense categories and the reserves. There's a lot of work that goes behind this budget. Each one of those entries represents, in some cases, guesstimates, in some cases, information attributable to what we know about our current contracts. In other cases, it's based upon known changes such as increases in utility fees. Management provides us with this, and we begin with the approved budget for the previous year, then a projected year end for that actual year. In this case, the numbers unfortunately only extend up until September, the end of September of that year. That's because the budgeting process is in October. So the projected is required because we add estimates or what we know about the next 3 months, which is October, November, and December. And then we have a proposed budget for the next year based upon what we actually do know. At the time, we undertake dealing with this. This, in fact, is the first task for a new board member. It can be somewhat daunting if someone is not familiar with the operation of the association. This is why it is really useful if owners attend meetings. It is even more useful if they attend the budgeting process, but many owners do not. And so when they are elected, they discover themselves dealing with things that they don't quite understand, and they may acquiesce to the current board. Now, that's not the best way to operate an association. Each board member should come in with sufficient knowledge of the association that they can actually work on this. In the budgeting, you'll notice two interesting things. One is, in our income, we now carry what's called a contra account. This is a negative number. It simply takes into account the reality that occurred in 2007 with the Great Recession, and that is an ongoing, continuous series of foreclosures and bankruptcies among owners. We have a very large association, 336 units. It's not unusual since 2007 to have an owner or owners struggling financially. Due to the vagaries of the Illinois Condominium Act and the courts, we don't always get to collect all of the fees that are due to us, and so we now carry a slightly negative number, which takes into account the bad debt, that is, uncollectible debt via those fees. The other thing is, you'll notice that in this budget, there was an additional amount added to reserves specifically for trees, $57,000. We don't allocate the reserves in the budgets. This is part of an entirely separate process. It's very elaborate. It's far more work than it would take as part of this simple annual budgeting process. What's most important is take the data from the reserves studies and the reserve charts and the spreadsheets and add them into this budget. So that's what we do. However, the board does have the ability and is perhaps mandated to take into account unusual circumstances in any given year. Given the situation with our trees, That's exactly what happened in 2015. The board decided to allocate an additional funds directly to deal with those problems. The final chart is a small portion of our actual reserve study spreadsheet. Our sheet comprises about 50 rows with a variety of items for everything from lighting to intercoms to creeks to streets to roofs and so on and so forth. It also encompasses 30 years in duration, so this particular sheet extends out to 2044. This is part of the process. Our board annually goes through everything we know about our infrastructure and plugs it into this spreadsheet, providing our own internal updates. We also then, on a periodic basis, hire a professional firm to take the information we have, study our association and its infrastructure, and provide us with a current update. This is an invaluable tool for establishing budgets. In conclusion, our budgeting process has identified a number of issues through 2016. Part of that is the fact that it occurs in October of each year, which means that the current year is incomplete, which makes projections somewhat difficult. Earlier annual reserve amounts were tracked as an annual event. In other words, any anomalies or shortfalls, for example, let's say due to circumstances we under-collected for reserves or unallocated because we spent more money on operations and maintenance. This would fall through the cracks, show up the next year as part of our current reserve budget. We'd say, well, we just contributed $30,000 this month, we're current. No, we might not be. So we now track each year independently as a separate budget item. So, for example, at the end of 2015, if we only make 98% of our reserve allocation target, we will show a 2% shortfall, which will carry over into the next year and can be addressed as part of the budgeting. Prior to 2011, issues with uncollectibles weren't recognized as bad debt. The first reserve study we ever had here by an outside unbiased firm was in 2010. We've since had several, and we do have ongoing updates and a lot of information plugged in each and every year. That includes detailed condition surveys for the streets, driveways, patios, decks, streams, garage floors, walks, building entrances, and on and on and on. These are conducted regularly and annually where possible since 2010. There is also a detailed budget review undertaken from time to time by the president, the architectural director. That provides us with additional spreadsheets for the reserves, and that is then plugged into by a committee which is comprised of currently by the architectural director, the maintenance director, and our treasurer. It is a goal that boards strive to smooth fees for their owners. Short-term adjustments to reserve collections can be a tool to facilitate this, and I recommend it, but it does take an acknowledgement of long-term requirements and a lot of knowledge about the infrastructure and the finances of any association. If you were to ask me what my greatest concerns are, it is, yes, we have reserve studies that look 30 years into the future. Yes, we do have closer looks, condition surveys, financing, and so on, put into place to look very closely at the requirements of the next 10 years. What we don't have is good continuity plans. We don't necessarily have a means of restaffing boards in an ongoing basis in which new people come in, acquire the necessary skills to replace the experts who retired. Because in all honesty, anyone who serves on a board for more than 5 years, 10 years, they carry with them a tremendous amount of expert knowledge. The challenge for associations is how to translate and transfer that expert knowledge into the boards that will carry on this work into the future. That, to me, is a challenge that continues to this very day. This challenge is exacerbated by the fact that in modern society, so few owners really want to participate. So we have fewer owners participating, and yet we have a requirement to design, develop, and implement plans for more than 30 years. It's extremely daunting.